Chapter 2, Basic Ideas of Finance. In this chapter, we'll be going over a number of concepts that you'll see throughout your personal finance journey. Income is what is earned or received in a given period. This could be through employment or self-employment. So if you work for an employer or you have your own business, you can earn wages or salary. Other ways to earn income might be through deposit accounts or savings accounts, and you earn interest. Another type of income could be through dividends if you are a shareholder of a stock or in a corporation. Now, there are two fundamental ways of earning income in a market-based economy. You can sell your labor by working for someone else or yourself, or you can sell capital. That's investing or taking the extra cash that you have and selling it or renting it to someone who needs cash. Make note of the term liquidity. This is the access to cash. A common example of selling capital would be investing in or buying corporate stock, because you're getting in exchange a share of the company's future value. In Figure 2.2, you can see some of the sources of income. For instance, if you work by selling your labor, as I mentioned before, in turn, you get wages or salary, and you're part of the labor market. If you are investing, you're selling capital, and in return, you're hoping for a profit or dividend capital, which is known as a gain. But if things don't work out so well, you may actually incur a loss. This is part of the capital market. Now, if you decide to lend, you could rent capital, and there you earn interest, and that's part of the credit market. Seeing as the labor market is most likely the market that you'll first encounter, the price of labor is the wage that an employer is willing to pay to the employee. So this is really a factor of supply and demand. If there are a lot of folks that have the education and skills to do a job, then there's more supply of labor than there is demand, or like job openings available. And in that case, the employer gets to pick and choose who's the best fit, and it's the buyer's market, the buyer being the employer. Now, in some careers where there are not as many people who can do that skill or that trade, then it becomes a seller's market. So those folks are in high demand. When you were looking at the different careers the other week, it's helpful to think about the demand behind it. Is this an area where there are more jobs than there are people or talent? That's going to make your marketability more attractive. When you are starting your career, you're usually in a buyer's market because you're starting at an entry-level job, unless you have some unusual gift or talent. And so the employer or the buyer will pay less for that position. But over your career, as you gain more experience, you'll be able to sell your labor at a higher price. Hopefully, you'll find a career that you enjoy doing and can excel in, which will make you more successful within the labor market. Capital markets exist so that buyers can buy capital. Businesses need capital and have limited ways to raise it. Some examples could be buying stocks, buying government or corporate bonds, or lending a mortgage, which can be turned into mortgage-backed securities for investors to purchase. Another concept you're likely familiar with is expenses. These are the costs for things that you use or consume in your daily lives. Examples include the food you eat, your housing costs, clothing, utility or cell phone bills, and so on. When your income is less than your expenses, you have a budget deficit. That means you don't have enough money to cover your wants or needs. This is not sustainable. Some options you can choose from is you can make more money or increase your income, reduce your expenses, cut back, or borrow to make up the difference. The downside to borrowing, though, is that it creates an additional expense. Oftentimes when you borrow, you have to also pay interest. One of the first ways to reduce your budget deficit is to consume less. Instead of eating out, cook at home. To save on fuel costs, consider carpooling. If you want to increase your income to help reduce your budget deficit, you can work more hours, get a second job, or find a way to sell more capital. Now, if your income is greater than your expenses, you're in a good position. This is known as a budget surplus. This is sustainable and financially viable. Knowing that you have extra income, you could consume more, you could spend more money. This will reduce your budget surplus. You can reduce your income by working less, and that will also reduce your budget surplus. Or, and this is my favorite, you can save and invest. This will increase your income and help you increase your budget surplus. Now, when we see a budget surplus, though, we can be tempted to spend it, whether on a vacation or a fancy dinner or some new clothes. But it's helpful to think the big picture regarding your personal financial goals and what you can do with that budget surplus. Thus, when you have a budget surplus, you can actually take that and put it into savings, whether that's putting it into a savings account at your bank, putting it into a retirement account, purchasing a certificate of deposit or government savings bond, or depositing it into a money market account where it can earn money. There are two other important kinds of costs that we should consider. The first is the opportunity cost, or the cost of sacrificing your next best choice. Ideally, you want the benefit of your decision making to outweigh or be greater than the opportunity cost. Let's look at an example. Imagine you're debating whether you want to buy your first home or you want to buy a new car, assuming you already have a car that you use to get around. Now, buying a new car might be nice because it's a brand new car, but now you have car payments. Whereas if you save up towards buying that home, then the opportunity cost is, well, I can't buy a new car. But the benefit is that you can get into a new home sooner. And there are a number of benefits related to home ownership, which we'll cover in later chapters. Then there's sunk costs, costs that have already been spent and there's no way to recover it. So if you instead decide to go ahead and buy that car, the money that you put towards that car is a sunk cost. You can't redirect that towards a down payment for that home you wanted to buy. Instead, your goal of buying a home will likely be stretched out farther into the future. Opportunity costs and sunk costs are hidden expenses that we often don't think about when it comes to our financial decision making. We tend to focus on what we're getting in that moment, not what we're missing out on. So that's why it's helpful to think about your financial goals and how your decisions impact them. What are the trades? What are you going to miss out on? What are the benefits? An asset is any item with economic value that can be converted to cash. Now, assets are useful because they can be used to store wealth, create income, or reduce future expenses. Here I've got some examples of assets, whether it's land, savings account, certificates of stock, a home, a car. All of these assets have economic value that can be converted to cash. If your asset is worth more when you sell it than when you bought it, you've earned a capital gain. But if the asset is worth less than when you sell it versus when you bought it, you've experienced a capital loss. And on the table to the right here, we have a number of assets and their roles. So you can see if we look at the store wealth column, most of these assets is a form of storing wealth, with the exception of the car. As we use a car, it generally depreciates. And then some assets not only store wealth, but also create income. So if we look at this column here, we can see that savings accounts, rental properties, and investments in bonds and stock can increase our income. So for instance, if you purchase a home and rent it out, you're earning rental income. And in terms of investing in stocks, you could be earning a dividend. And in a savings account, you're earning interest. And then some of these assets actually help to reduce expenses. Here, our car helps us to reduce our expenses. So instead of using public transportation or renting a car, we bought a car to drive to work. Buying a home can potentially also be cheaper in the long run than renting one, as there are a number of benefits in terms of buying a home, such as tax benefits and building equity. Now, for some investors, they care more about increasing asset value than about income. So a company may decide to reinvest its profit back into the company so that it can grow and increase in value, which in turn will help investors' wealth. Or they can take that money and pay it out as dividends. Now let's talk about debt and equity. You can buy capital from other investors in exchange for an ownership share. This is known as equity, and it represents your claim on any future gains or future income. Now, the cost of equity, though, is that you have to share the benefits from the investment. So if things aren't working out so well, you are also sharing in the losses in proportion to the share of the asset that you own. Now, when you're borrowing or renting someone else's money for a period of time, this is known as debt. And the cost of debt is the rent or interest that you have to pay during that period of time that the debt is outstanding. So you can see here, with equity, you're buying capital, and with debt, you're borrowing capital. When you buy equity in a company, you share in the ups and the downs, and when you're borrowing, you have to pay that company interest. So let's look at some examples of debt. With credit cards, you can use that to finance your living expenses. An auto loan or a mortgage loan can help you finance a car or a home, respectively. And if you can't afford to pay for college, you can get a college loan to help fund your education. Now, the value behind these debts is that with your credit cards, you can enjoy the benefits sooner rather than later. This is the convenience factor. And recall in the previous slides, we talked about how a car and a home can help reduce future expenses. So the value of getting that loan in order to buy your car or buy your home sooner rather than later is to help reduce those expenses. And the value of getting a college loan is that you'd be able to gain an education that will help you earn a higher future income. Now, in order to pay those debts, credit cards, auto loans, and mortgage typically use our current income on a monthly basis to pay. And in terms of the college loan, we're hoping that our future income will be able to pay off and cover the college loan. Overall, debt is not something you should fear. It can enable you to get an asset sooner rather than later and reap more rewards. But you have to be responsible about it by understanding how much you really can afford and your ability to pay back those debts on a timely basis. Lastly, let's talk about income and risk. So in addition to trying to get what you want, you have to protect it. One way to do that is through diversification, where you're spreading the risk. So you may have heard the phrase, don't put all your eggs in one basket, because if something happens to that basket, you lost all your eggs. So rather than putting all your money into one form of investment or one form of income, you want to put your efforts and your money spread out. We often hear about diversifying our investments, but it's also important to think about diversifying our sources of income. So in addition to selling your labor, consider ways of selling capital. Nowadays, it's very common to hear about side hustles. In addition to one's full-time job, maybe you have a business on the side. Maybe you make jewelry and sell it, or you like to bake and sell your cookies and cakes. When I was working full-time in corporate, my side hustle was teaching in the evenings. And now that I'm a full-time college professor, my side hustle is consulting in the areas of expertise that I used to do when I was in corporate. So in addition to diversifying your sources of income, keep in mind, and we'll learn in later chapters, that you also want to diversify by investing in a variety of assets. That way, if something happens in the economy or in the markets, and there's a downturn, a source of income or an investment that's not doing too well will be offset by something that's doing fine in another market or area.